Welcome to the Asimov Press podcast. It is my absolute pleasure to be talking to Xander Balwit. Um, my name is Niko McCarty, and today we're going to talk about a science fiction article that Xander wrote that actually became reality. So it's interesting because I always harp on about writing is manifesting, writing to bring things in the real world, and Xander did exactly that. So why don't we start at the top and just tell me about first the science fiction piece?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this kind of the conversation we're having begins with a piece that I wrote back in October, which was called FARMA, and it was envisioning a restaurant by the same name that was set in San Francisco and really leaning into all things food technology. So, a restaurant whose menu was very celebrant of all things GMO, molecular gastronomy, different kinds of alternative proteins. I think really dialing in on this idea of what is future food, especially future food that is driven by technology, and having a place where that was concretized and celebrated and part of the cultural milieu. So I wrote about what that could look like, expanded on a fictive menu, and then in the storytelling, kind of woven both a description of this place and then also the purpose it served. Like it was guided by this thesis that we need more food technology. So that is also a part of the story.
So you could be writing sci-fi like as a space opera. You could be writing sci-fi about AI destroying humanity. Why even write science fiction about food? Like, what's your connection to food?
Well, I've always been incredibly food motivated. As my parents would be the first to say, some of my first words involved food terminology, and I feel like at the event actually that I hosted in the image of this, which we'll get to, I started by being like, my interest in food is only intensified after going vegan. Even like the more constraints you throw at it, it seems like there's nothing that can dampen the enthusiasm. But to give you a more serious answer, I think I like to think about areas that have the largest bearing on human flourishing. And I think about this often because when you talk to people that are skeptical of technologies and you're like, well, name something that's good, name something that technology has given you, they often leap to medicine before food. And while that makes sense and like medicine is amazing, I'm often like, there's an even lower hanging fruit that you did not mention that we engage with 3 times a day that seems like very fundamental when it comes to human flourishing. So I think about food both from a personal interest perspective and also from a, like, it just has a bearing on absolutely everything else perspective.
Right. So you write this piece, and at the end, right, I remember there was a sentence that was like, "Pharma is currently fictive, but it needn't be." What happened when we published that article and people read this sci-fi restaurant thing? Well, first of all, some people thought it was real, right?
Yeah,
And
I
we
got some.
got emails.
I
Yeah,
looked on Google Maps and I couldn't find it.
yeah,
Yeah, I felt like a food betrayer. Yeah, I mean the response was great. I think like myself, other people were wondering why there wasn't more embrace of kind of technological optimism in the food space in San Francisco, and so there was a real like, oh, this definitely should exist. I also think that it's fun when you go into a space and you like don't know it super well, and you're like, why isn't this happening? And then of course, where all the people are actually making it happen, they're like, what about me? What about me? And so I think it was a fun way to kind of see what came out of the woodwork as well, to be like, I don't see enough of X thing happening. Have a bunch of people that are in the alt protein space or making GMO products be like, I exist and I would like to contribute. So it's kind of just a fun way to almost like pour acid down a hole and see what crawls out of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, like, what happened? Like, who reached out to you? How long did it? Well, like, I guess when we published the piece, were you actually thinking, I'm going to turn this into a restaurant, or was it kind of like, we'll see what happens?
I think that was definitely there from the beginning. I mean, when I write anything fictive that's envisioning like how I want the world to be otherwise, I often do have like a piece of me that's like genuinely I would like to see what kind of if this could bring about anything in the real world. So I think even when I had written the piece, I was hoping that it would come to fruition in some really concrete way. Um, but yeah, no, it took a while for that to actually happen. It was something I was marinating on, and then as I kind of got more into the food space in San Francisco, I was starting to meet people that had either, participated in various future food themed things, whether it was tastings or hosting their own thing like this, and finally met some chefs that were also very interested in working with kind of progressive food elements and various other things that were kind of new and interesting. And so the pieces came together slowly, but I think from the beginning, as soon as I published it and started to see like kind of what interest existed and what products I'd have to work with, and then find the right people, it all started to come together.
Yeah. And in the piece itself, I guess my last question about the piece, because I think it's interesting to kind of provide a window into how sci-fi gets created. Um, the thing that always makes sci-fi resonate with me is that there are elements of reality. There are many elements of truth, and then it's kind of just like twisting that truth a little bit or projecting where that truth will go. So I'm curious, like in that initial piece, how much of it was real or real food products in development, and how much of it was made up food products, and like how do you even decide how to make up a food product?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think sci-fi is always like the most powerful when it's rooted in something really concrete that people can see, and obviously that's done to me most effectively if you're actually gesturing at things that are real. So fortunately, there was some real like ingredients and products and things that I could reference. But I think finding that balance between how much quantitative support do you want to put in a piece that is largely rooted in fiction or storytelling, which is something we think about for our nonfiction as well, right? Like, how do you balance something that is supposed to be more evocative and character driven with kind of real data and real credible sources? And we're like in sort of case study here. And I think it's just that by itself wouldn't compel people, nor would just narrative. Like I think these things really reinforce one another, is having the veracity that's brought by like real data and having things actually be true, and then also, hopefully compelling storytelling and world building. But I feel like if I had just hit this with logic, like GMOs are safe, that would have been a very different piece. And so instead I wanted to kind of balance, like I'm actually painting you a picture of a real restaurant where things have tastes and things have smells, and then also being like, and this is supported by like products that actually have interesting histories that exist and like real facts that should make you kind of buy into why we might want a food transition and how we should
Mhm.
think about changing our food systems.
Right. And so this piece goes out, companies started reaching out to you. Some people thought that it was already a real restaurant. Um, how long did it take like for things to come together?
I would say a few months of concerted effort, and that was like trying to figure out the right space, who we would want to have in the room, some kind of basic budgetary questions, like what would it take, were we going to get a ton of, donations for this, or you forget also like, oh, like it's nice to like center a few products, but that can't be all you eat, right? Especially if you want to actually fill people up, and there's like ways this could have looked really different with like giving people cocktails and a few things to try, and then there was actually creating this like full blown restaurant experience, which again was like kind of what I was holding up as like the final boss of what this could look like. But there were lots of smaller things along the way, whether it was like a perfectly curated meal or something much easier. But I think trying to find like the right way that it should come together took a little while, and then finding chefs that I really wanted to work with, which I ended up finding through this kind of like hackathon that was related to alt proteins and future foods. And I met people who'd already kind of done some things on this theme and really animated about that. Like me, they were like, I imagine the food transition. And I was like, oh, you're speaking my language. So by the time I got them on board back in like probably late February or something, I started seeing the pieces come together a lot more concretely.
Yeah. What were some of the ingredients that, well, I guess what were some of the companies that reached out right away that were like, yes, I love this. Let me give you food products.
Yeah, I mean, some of the people that reached out right away that we ended up using Norfolk Healthy Produce that makes the purple GMO tomato. So actually, like stepping back again, when I initially was like, let me make a menu based on real stuff, right? Like, let's see what's actually out there. I thought it was going to just be a ton. Like, this was very naive, but I was like, I'm sure there's going to be GMO this and that, and like little pieces. And most of our GMO products are still like, food crops or soy or corn and things that are largely invisible. Like, we're not really yet at the stage where like you go into the supermarket and you see a whole aisle devoted to GM produce or things like that. So I had to kind of see what was actually in existence and what I could have access to. So the purple tomato was fantastic. We actually got our hands on some of the, the pink pineapple that has been GMO'd through Dole. So that was great. And then there were a few other people as well from just kind of the alt protein space, Better Meat Company, who we didn't end up using for the event because it didn't end up working in the menu quite the way we wanted to. But there were lots of people that, like from the beginning were like, I hear you and we'd love to participate. So hopefully down the line, some of those others that didn't make it in will get to be in other iterations.
Mhm. And so the theme of the event, right, was all Americana. Like can you walk me through the theme? Like why that? And I'm sure that was reflected in how you thought about choosing a space, maybe, or how you thought about choosing chefs. It's like first you had to kind of try to fit this theme, right?
Yeah, so I think for the theme, I mean, again, in the piece, it was much more like my original sci-fi was much more rooted in kind of fine dining because there's like a lot of demonstration that has been done in something very like exclusive and everyone wants to turn their attention to this thing. Um, but I was trying to figure out the right balance of that. And like one of the real virtues of food technology is that it's primarily about access. It's like who gets to actually eat the thing that you're describing and benefit from the thing you're describing. So I think trying to figure out how avant garde I wanted to go was something that was on my mind when I was thinking about the piece. And what ended up shaping it more than anything else is that we hosted it during Climate Week. And so a lot of that, to try to make it kind of fit that theme, we were like, there's of course lots of benefits to food technology, but one of them is that it has real climate impact in a positive direction. And so to do that, what would you need to replace? And it's kind of the elements of our food system that are the most intensive and the most taxing on land and water and things like that. So it ended up being very center of the plate, very meat focused. So when we were working with that, it kind of really shaped the menu into trying to make it a bunch of cuisine that was super central to the American diet. Things like hamburgers, things like chicken fried steak. And so from there, we kind of spun out into this more Americana trad kind of aesthetics that I leaned into.
And was the meal vegan or
It
like
was actually, I
technically
had a
vegan?
fun. Somebody was asking me about that, and usually, like, I'm usually the person asking that question, and so it was fun to get a bunch of incoming emails. I was like, I'd love to go, but is it vegan? And being like, fuck yes. But also, I was trying to figure out how best to describe cultivated meat because we actually were able to get some real cultured pork fat cells from Mission Barns, which again, you kind of gestured at like what was in your original piece and how did it actually turn out. Is this Mission Barns wasn't even on my radar or even able to sell their product when I wrote this piece back in October. But in March, they were the first company to receive their approval for their cultivated pork fat cells. And so we ended up using their product. And it was interesting being like, yes, and for the vegan question, like it kind of depends on what you're like, it is derived from real animal, but it is, like harm and suffering free. So yes, it was fully vegan outside of that one product that I still am like, how best to frame that, depending on who's asking.
So any cultured, like, there's also a fish company, right? Doing fish cells. Did they donate ingredients?
So that's one of the reasons we didn't have ticketed spots is they had not yet received their approval again at the time of this meal. And so by now, actually, just last week they got approval from the FDA to sell their product as well. So they're selling in my hometown of Portland. They're working with a restaurant. But they didn't participate in this particular meal, which is again very rooted in more like traditional milk. Meat. Like we had thought about going biome by biome and maybe doing like an ocean course and then kind of a land and like plains course. But instead, we ended up really focusing on a lot of traditional American fare. So fish was kind of less present in that. But yeah, Wild Type has also received approval, which is great.
So the dinner kind of envisioned like the American dinner table in 50 years, right? That was the thing. It was like green Americana, 2060 something. I don't, correct me if I'm wrong. I guess I'm curious, like, I'm not vegan. I know you're vegan. I'm trying to become a vegetarian. Um, when these cultured meat products like really reach mainstream and we have cultured pork belly and cultured chicken and whatever in the grocery store, like, are these things that vegans are going to accept? Like, will vegans eat these things? Because they're not really like traditional vegan food, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it depends on the type of vegan and what is driving that choice for them. Like for me, it is just very founded in animal ethics and this kind of idea of not even animal rights so much, where like I would never eat any animal, even a biopsy is like a violation of their right. It's more in truly the outcome, like kind of net suffering. And I think again, factory farming is one of the ways that we see the most suffering. So if you remove that and you are creating meat used from a biopsy that is then proliferated in a lab, to me that takes away all of the harm that I care about. So I would be like, I would fully embrace that future of meat. I think there are others that come at this slightly differently that may still have their own reasons why they don't, whether it's a health reason or it still feels like a violation of the animal even from that initial thing. Or I've even met vegans that are just like, animals are gross, like I just don't want to, I'll stick to beans. So I think it really depends, but I imagine that a vast majority of people that were kind of oriented similarly to how I see the question would still embrace this as something that they would want to have access to.
You said at the beginning that you kind of set out to, because you care about our food system and stuff like that. I think my initial gut reaction when you talk about things like that is climate, like animal agriculture as like a climate sort of contributor. But were you actually coming at this from more like the veganism aspects, like the animal suffering aspect? Like, is that what you mean when you say the future of food?
I mean, I think it often all comes back to that. Like for me, that is still so central. So like I try to be really tactful here and not just sound like an absolute bleeding heart. And there are again very good reasons to care about it from a climate perspective, from a health perspective. But for me, it does come back to animal ethics. And I think Yeah, and at the same time, like when I say like I don't want to sound like a bleeding heart, like there's so many very reasonable ways to frame this, right? Like when you asked about balancing like the amount of like fact and supporting data alongside the storytelling, like I always come back to this issue of like 80% of all habitable land is used for animal agriculture. Like I think even someone who like participates in that is still like that's a lot. Like is that as good as we can do? So yes, the vegan thing was driving it, but I think also this embrace of like I think people just we can do better. Like we can use our water in more clever ways. We can use land in more clever ways. And to me it all does come back to animal agriculture, but I think that there's so many roads in that that doesn't need to be the thing. So while I was secretly there gleeful like, oh, this really reflects my worldview, like I think there's other ways that this still is very reasonable to people that are coming at it from all sorts of perspectives.
And my last question, I realize that this is such an insane detour, and I'm not even talking about the event really anymore. But you know, you and I, we have almost commissioned many pieces that examine cultured meat, right? And people in that space know, well, I guess there's a debate, right? Like venture capitalists continue to fund cultured meat, even as many other people that do techno-economic analyses say that cultured meat will never scale because it just doesn't make any sense. Um, do you think that that's okay? Like what is cultured meat good for if it never scales? But let's assume the case where there is no technology breakthrough. The reports are true. People who have crunched the numbers who say this is never going to scale, like let's just assume that they're right. Like is cultured meat still a good thing, or are we just kind of like privileged Westerners going to dinners eating cultured meat when it doesn't actually really matter for animal agriculture?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question because I don't want it to just be aspirational. Like the idea that it wouldn't scale is kind of like soul damaging in some way. So I guess the idea like if you lived in some world where you were sure it never scaled, then maybe it's kind of hard to kind of find a justification for its existence, I suppose. But even a world in which it doesn't happen on the timelines that we think it will happen on, but it represents this like very real achievement in tissue engineering and this sense of possibility, I still think that is worth aiming towards. I mean, I guess even what it represents is like some version of future food, like presenting an alternative. I like this idea of like a very expansive dietary future. If it's not cultured meat, and cultured meat is just one kind of demonstration of what that could look like, there are still so many other things and other ways that we could eat in a way that is less, kind of taxing and intensive. That I still think, even as a representation of that whole, just to give you like a kind of window in, then it still has value.
Yeah. I wonder what fraction of the American diet is high fructose corn syrup.
Probably a great deal. Um, yeah, I mean, even like going back to this like kind of dietary futurism, I think also like I had this very specific vision when I hosted mine, and like the menu looked a certain way, and it was like it ended up being kind of a like a capstone of one version that this could look like. But I wanted to ideally like this would kick off a whole bunch of kind of copycats and more people that wanted to do the same thing. And there's already been people that have hosted future food diets that have been rooted in very different food futures, like edible insects and entomophagy, or like I certainly got ideas from this one. Like I wanted to host a meal where the menu is completely made out of invasive species, or there's another one that I have in mind that could be all roadkill. Like any way to kind of comment on like our worlds are changing, different things are factoring into how we relate to the land and how we relate to nature, and this will all come through in diets in the future. So I just want it to be very expansive, I suppose.
Imagine getting an invite to a roadkill dinner.
I mean, I would go wholeheartedly.
I
I
know
was
you would go. Yeah.
actually looking into this, and I was like, there are some states that actually make it like legal to harvest roadkill, like Alaska, for example, because it's cold enough that the roadkill doesn't start to putresce. But I was like, I don't
Oh,
think if anyone would be interested in eating rats from the mission, at least not yet. So.
yeah. So let's get into the event. So walk me through it. Like people show up. Well, I guess like where was it? When was it? What did the room look like? Like were you scrambling to set up? How many people were involved in setting it up?
Yeah, we got some great support. So night of, there were the two chefs and a handful of people that they had helping them out, and then we worked with an event company called Naked Kitchen that is based in like the center of San Francisco in the Mission, and they have a really beautiful space that's used for chef pop-up dinners. So we hosted there just because it was like the perfect space for kind of an intimate dinner party for 30 people, and their staff was awesome. But what did it look like? I mean, we had carved out like 4 hours to use the space, which initially I was like, oh, that's so much time. Like, how are we possibly going to entertain ourselves? And it ended up being the kind of thing that throughout the evening I was constantly looking at my watch and making sure that we were on schedule. Because I wanted to have programming as well. I wanted people to come and enjoy, but then I thought that this was really driven by a piece of fiction and that storytelling should absolutely appear throughout. So I introduced that in various intervals by having between each course, having someone stand up and kind of help move the story along. So we were eating alongside storytelling. So it ended up having many different phases throughout the evening and was like not nearly enough time.
What were those stories?
So initially, I was kind of like, what would I actually have to prove out in order to convince people that we needed some kind of different dietary future? And I think a lot of that, like for me, that begins with justifying why we need a food transition. So I had Shayna Feartig, who is the advisor to the president of Good Food Institute, and she spoke to kind of what we're talking about when we talk about the dietary transition. What are we responding to? And it was things that it kind of paints a very dismal picture, right, about land use and water and growing population and things like that. But I thought that that was useful for setting the stage instead of just assuming that our diets are going to change. Like, why now? Why are we having this conversation in 2025? So it began with that. Then in the middle, I had someone actually say, like, what will it take to kind of empower the people that are building alternatives? So I had Bianca Lee from Mission Barns talk about actually what it looks like to get regulatory approval. And as someone who works in this space, how do you actually make people come up with things that people are going to want to buy? And then the last phase was from Rebecca Chesney, who's a food anthropologist. And I wanted her to kind of dilate on like what it will take to actually adopt those foods once they exist. So it's not enough for people like Bianca to produce something really lovely and then have no one want it. Like, what will we actually need to have happen in order for people to want to embrace a food transition? So I kind of had this whole arc of like why we need it, what will happen, how we do it kind of come to the fore.
Interesting. And it sounds like all nonfiction.
Yeah, and actually, there was some embrace of my theme because again, I set it in the future because I wanted it to be very much like, I mean, the diet that or like the meal we're about to eat is based on very real foods that exist today that we're all trying, but they're all kind of future foods. And so let's imagine that it's 2055, and then the conversations would be more like, what will it take to get there? So I had it still be kind of scenario building or almost diagnostic of like, if this is where we end up, how did we get there? And there were some of the storytellers, like Bianca in particular, who really leaned into telling that story in the context of fiction. Like she was addressing the guests like, generation gamma that's born between like 2045 and 2055 when this is set will be thinking this way about future foods. So it was rooted in nonfiction, but it also appealed to some elements of fiction as well, which I loved.
And walk me through the menu. Like
Um,
people show up, there's hors d'oeuvres, they get cocktails.
the menu was insane. We definitely like went way harder on the food than and actually also it was when I say it was insane, like I saw where it was going from the beginning, but I also hadn't really tried anything on here. Like I tried some companies' meats at various tastings and things like that, but that was the biggest uncertainty going in is like I'm trying to like paint this very persuasive picture about the future of food. And I was actually quite nervous that I would try a bunch of stuff and be like, this sucks, because that has been an experience I have had with many like vegan products throughout my life. But the menu was, yeah, there was welcoming bites, and then there were three main courses and a dessert trio, and each one was like fairly substantial as well. So it was really fun to like work with a lot of product and have chefs that were really into like, no, let's just throw everything we have at it.
Do you think, based on this event, that there would be enough market demand to actually open a restaurant that serves this stuff exclusively?
I really hope so. I wonder how strong of a gimmick it is. Like I would want it to not be rooted in these foods or like this particular iteration of what this is, but I think the embrace of like we are a restaurant that looks to the cutting edge of food technology would be really special. And there are restaurants that like kind of want to be very novel and incorporate interesting things that people haven't had before. Like I think that must be like the hallmark of very good chefs is like wanting to already kind of stretch people's intuitions and experiences when it comes to food that they're having. But I think like a full on embrace of whatever is newest and how can I support the companies that are building this, especially here in the Bay Area where we do have a lot of companies that are working on interesting alt protein products and molecularly aged beverages and things like that. Like if those had a home somewhere where people could go to actually be like, I want to know what is, happening this week in the cultured meat space or, the alternative milk space, I could see that there being a real appetite for that.
And, so you plan this for months. So let's exclude labor costs. But like, how many guests were there, and then how much did the whole thing cost? Just because I think that's interesting to say, like, Well, I mean, first of all, it's kind of weird that a publishing company, we are already budget constrained. Not really, like we're fortunate. I
We're
don't,
okay for all
I
those that
don't,
are listening.
I don't know if we want to like cut this out or whatever, but I think people would be curious, like, so let's start there and then we can kind of talk about like why even do this as a publishing company.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I had 30 guests there, and the total cost, I mean, labor was actually not. I mean, I think it was the most substantial part of it, mostly just because again, the chefs that I worked with, Phil Sineski and Emily Hopkins, were just so brilliant that they really helped with ideation as well. So they like again, kind of being new to San Francisco, they were deeply connected in the food space, and so a lot of their introductions to folks that were working in it and connections to SF Climate Week already ended up really helping out.
I
Um,
mostly meant your labor, Sandra, because you
oh,
spent like,
yeah, my labor was uncompensated. That was part of like between editing pieces. That's what I did. Yeah, and I got to, of course,
you
benefit.
are paid. Like you do have a
It's a little
salary.
love, not that much love. Um, yeah, so I mean, total cost it ended up working out to like without labor around like 11K thereabouts, and that also includes like graphic design and renting the space and supporting all of these places that wanted to give us product, and there was some mix of donation there and also having to purchase things, and then of course fleshing out the menu with additional supplemental products, which was also fun because I was kind of like again, it's nice to see companies have some success, right? Like I was initially like, maybe people are just going to want to throw product at us. And then some of these places that have gotten further along are like, it's purchasable at Whole Foods. Like just support us if you're interested in future food. So that was kind of great to see as well. I was like, okay, we can actually just go find the algae bacon at Whole Foods.
How much do you think you could like get these costs down? Like if you were to do another dinner, could you do it for 5K?
I mean, it depends on scope and scale, but I could definitely, like, what I liked is that this was definitely providing, yeah, again, one version of how this could look, but it could look very different depending on where we host it, how many people we have, what product we're leaning into. Are we using a bunch of kind of expensive alternative ingredients that now need to recoup their cost from the various years that they've been in R&D, or are we using a lot of products that have been sourced from places where it's like easier to come by these things? And so I think I could definitely throw something for 5K and probably something really cool. And then I also have all of the experience that I built in terms of building out programming and reaching out to the right people. And so a very flexible format that I can imagine becoming, yeah, very achievable, much more cheaply.
Um, and you're the editor in chief of Asimov Press. I'm curious what your rationale is like to do this. Like, why don't we just publish articles? For $11,000, like we could have done a lot. We could have hired an artist. We could have worked on a book. Like, why do a dinner?
Oh, there's so many answers to this. There's so many components, I guess, to the answer. I think you and I often talk a lot about like getting real immediate feedback about the stuff that you're putting out, about the writing you're putting out. Is it of value? Are people listening? Do they care at all? And so I think it's really refreshing to host a live event based on fiction as well, or based on something we've written, but then show immediately the appetite for a piece like that and its kind of ability to bring people together in real life who benefited in some way from this event, even if just telling me they had a fantastic time or that this was the highlight of their climate week or something. But the feedback is so much more immediate than you get when you put something out into the world, and like maybe you hear from a few people that you liked it, or a few people like it on Substack, but that's really abstract, and it's kind of hard to get the full sense of if that's landed with people. Whereas if you bring people together in person and you're actually there for 4 hours listening to people have stimulating conversations, and then there's follow-up after and people want to be invited to the next one, that feels much more concrete in a way. So I think there's an argument to be made that that's probably the biggest reason to do something like that. And then you and I also like talk about AI often and how that's going to change writing. And so I think, again, showing up as a real in-person physical community, in addition maybe to whatever ended up happening with what happens with writing, is going to be a value there as well.
Will there be a next one?
I hope so. So in the piece that is coming out alongside this conversation, I talk a little bit about, kind of I break down what happened at the event. I share some of the wonderful photos that, again, made up some of the cost of running this thing, and then kind of highlight some ideas for future ones. So the invasive species dinner in particular is one that I'd be really keen to host. So if that makes sense for folks that are thinking about biocontrol and kind of ecological management, there's, the biotech side of that question as well. Like, I just think that would be a really interesting conversation, and that would facilitate a really cool menu. So I have that one on the brain. Anyone in Alaska who wants to work on a roadkill dinner can do so. But I definitely would love to see some future events that look like this.
Nice. Well, yeah, thanks so much, Xander. Great work. I know people really enjoyed the event, and it was great to talk to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for reading.